So we've come out of some of the more theoretical, a little bit more abstract theoretical portions of the class. We started with kind of the main differences between environmental economics and ecological economics and different conceptions of sustainability and different ways of seeing the economy as nested within the broader ecological system. And we talked about the ways that standard economic theory typically does not build in the kinds of pollution absorption services that the environment provides, nor does it typically build in the raw material services that the environment provides. Those are the sink and source functions that we had talked about, and typically those are sort of taken for granted in the standard circular flow model, whereas in the expanded circular flow model, those kinds of services are accounted for much more directly and explicitly. And so one of the things we're going to do in this section is kind of think about those sink and source functions and how to put some numbers on those different goods and services that the environment provides, and how to estimate that, and potentially we want to be moving towards building that in. I mean, ideally, if those things are important, which we know they are, we'd like to have some ability to quantify that and show that it's important to preserve these things for these reasons, and we can give some data or some empirical results which show how valuable these goods and services are, and that can inform policy to not degrade them. You know, if you could demonstrate that these resources have very significant value, that's part of an argument towards preservation, and you can put that argument forward to say if there's some activity which will result in degradation, these valuation techniques can be used as kind of a rebuttal to that, or at least a counterbalancing force to act against the pure forces of just economic development and the direct use of environmental resources for consumption and production goods. And if you remember, one of the key distinctions between environmental economics and ecological economics that we talked about back at the beginning, one of the ways that those two perspectives differed was the way that they thought about environmental value. The ecological economics perspective was much more likely to account for inherent value or intrinsic value or value of the environment independent of whether there are humans in proximity to enjoy or to use the environmental goods and services. And then if you remember the environmental economics perspective, everything was based on willingness to pay. It all kind of came back to willingness to pay. And all kinds of values, all kinds of amenity values for environmental goods and services were legitimate, provided that there was somebody, some human being sitting there with a wallet and some cash in the wallet, willing to pay something for those goods and services. Regardless of how abstract the environmental goods and services are, the economic value was legitimate as long as you had somebody with some Benjamins or something like that to fork out that money to pay for that. I guess that's Benjamin Franklin there in the middle. So that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about some of the ways that the rubber meets the road here in environmental valuation, or how we actually maybe construct some of these marginal benefit curves and marginal cost curves that we've been talking about in an abstract way in say chapter 3 and chapter 4 and 5. Okay, so that's where we've come from. We've done all this. We are now entering environmental valuation territory. Let's just start off with some basic categories of values. So we have different types of environmental values. The first basic category that we can distinguish is between use values and non-use values. We've got underneath use, we've got direct use values and indirect. So if we think about a forest, a direct use value would be it could be the recreation that I described, where you actually go out and you observe the forest, you take a hike in the forest, you go bird watching in the forest. That's a legitimate use value or a direct use value. Another one is just the fact that there's timber that you can cut down in the forest and actually use that to make furniture or houses or something like that, like the frames of a house. That's a direct use value. We already said recreation. Recreation is another direct use value. If you go if you go out and you go canoeing on a lake, that's a direct use value of the lake, or a direct use of the lake, and you're getting value from it. If we think about, again, if we stick to this example of the forest, there is also a number of services the forest provides which you don't directly consume in the same way that you do the physical wood, or even going out to experience it yourself. And some of those could be carbon storage. Now, this is still a use value because it has the potential to directly affect your life. Like it's the fact that the forest captures and stores carbon means that the carbon concentration in the atmosphere is going to be a little bit lower than it otherwise would be, and therefore whatever of climate change effects, whatever sea level rise or whatever kinds of warming would happen, which could cause damages, you won't be as affected by that. The more carbon is stored in the forest. So it directly affects your life, but you're not going out and using it the same way that you are if you're cutting down the tree for lumber, or if you're going to actually just go take a walk in it. So things like ecosystem services like carbon storage, also something like erosion control, the existence of the trees or the existence of the forest helps to keep the soil intact. It helps to prevent runoff and landslides and things like that, which could you could lose a lot of topsoil. So erosion control, again, that's not something that you don't wake up and say, I'm going to consume a little bit more erosion control today. But those are things that you get, like you do directly get those things from the forest. In between this use and non-use categories, there's actually something that's a little bit in between. I'm going to write this down. That's sort of in between here, and that would be something called vicarious use value, which isn't in the book, but I think it's kind of an interesting extra way that you might use the environment. This could be like if you enjoy watching wildlife documentaries or wildlife films. In that case, you're not directly going out into the African savanna and observing the zebra, or the zebra as they say, or the antelope or the kudu or the springbok. You're not going out there and you're not directly going out and seeing those yourself. You're not taking a trip to physically go there, but you are getting, in a sense, you're kind of using it vicariously through somebody else who's going out and filming it, showing you pictures of it, showing you, giving you an inside look into some of the lives of the animals out there on the African savanna. Those kinds of things are another way that you might use the environment, and it might have value to you through your enjoyment of documentaries that are narrated by Sir David Attenborough. So that's another thing, maybe somewhere in between use and non-use, which is also a legitimate economic value. And there's other examples of indirect and direct use for any kind of environmental resource. So if instead of, we kind of were thinking about this through the lens of a forest resource, we could also think of it as a wetland. If you wanted to think about the direct and indirect uses of a wetland, well, I'm not sure how many direct uses of a wetland there are. I mean, you could go boating on a wetland if you wanted to. It's a little bit, it can be sometimes difficult. It's not exactly designed for canoeing. There's a lot of reeds and other vegetation in the wetland, which could make it hard to take a canoe on it. So maybe you don't have as many direct uses of a wetland, but certainly there are tons of indirect uses in terms of the habitat that a wetland provides, and especially the services that the wetland provides in terms of managing drainage and flood control. So wetlands are very good at absorbing water and preventing flooding, especially in coastal areas. So one of the big factors that made I believe it was Hurricane Harvey, when it hit Houston think it was Hurricane Harvey back in maybe 2017 or 18 when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston. They got like 40 inches of rain over a couple day period, and one of the things that made it especially damaging for Houston was the fact that a lot of the natural wetlands had been sort of developed and filled in and removed from that area, and it exacerbated the flooding a lot more than it otherwise would have been if there were wetlands there to kind of naturally absorb and retain the water and not have it kind of just pile up and run off directly into the land around Houston. So the wetlands provide maybe not so much direct use values, but definitely a lot of indirect use values in terms of flood control. Okay, so some of the non-use values that matter are there's three of them. I guess broadly speaking, there's three main categories of non-use values, and so those are, one of them is option value. One way to think about option value is you're not actively using an environmental resource right now, but you might want to in the future. You may have never visited Yellowstone National Park or Yosemite National Park, but perhaps it's something that you'd like to do someday. And so even if you haven't used it so far, you get value from it based on the fact that it still exists, and you might be able to go and visit that park in the future and experience go see the sequoia trees and the other kinds of environmental amenities that are housed in those parks, in those national parks. That might have value to you as just an option right now. You're not using it right now, but it's nice to know that it's there to go to visit if you wanted to get around to it. That's a legitimate economic value, is option value. You might also think of this in terms of what kinds of substances or chemicals might be stored inside of environmental resource, like a rainforest, for example. There might be a species of frog in the Amazon rainforest that secretes some kind of substance which ends up having a very useful pharmaceutical benefit, and it could represent the cure for some kind of disease. And we haven't discovered it yet, but it might be there. Given how many species are in the Amazon, many species that we haven't even discovered yet or cataloged yet. It's possible there's something there which will eventually we'll realize has some kind of medical use and is able to relieve pain and suffering, or even save people from death, depending on what the disease is and what the substance is and how it works inside the body. If we don't have the rainforest there, if we cut down the rainforest, we lose some of those species that could potentially have something very valuable to us that we would use in the future. And so that would be another example of option value. We haven't identified the substance or the chemical yet, but given just how many species there are with all kinds of different biological compositions, we'd expect that there could be something there which could potentially have some kind of pharmaceutical or medical use, which would be very valuable to human beings eventually. So that's another example of option value, and it's a non-use value because we're not putting it to use at the moment. All right, another legitimate environmental value is it's known as the bequest value, which is the value of something. It's valuable to you today because you know that you can pass it on to your kids and your grandkids or future generations. They don't necessarily have to be related to you, but some of the value of the environment could just be that bequest value of knowing that you can pass it on, and future generations can enjoy it, and you can in fact derive benefit from it today, knowing that you can pass it on. The last non-use value is existence value. In this case, you're not getting value from it based on the fact that you can potentially use it in the future. You're not getting value from it from being able to pass it on to your kids or grandkids or other future generations. You're simply getting value from it because you know that it's there and you know that it exists, and it somehow gives you pleasure, enjoyment. You enjoy knowing that there are things like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, pristine environments up in the near the North Pole, which are relatively untouched by human beings. You enjoy knowing that those things exist, knowing that those things are there, and you probably have no intention of, you may have some intention of going to visit there eventually, but even if you don't, even if you know for sure that you're not going to go visit the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, even if you know you're not going to do that, you could still have, it's still legitimate for you to get some economic benefit and some value from just knowing that natural environment, that pristine natural environment, is being preserved. That's a little bit like inherent value. Like we talked about at the beginning, inherent value being what ecological economists ascribe to the environment and to the earth. Maybe the closest thing on this list to that inherent value is the existence value. But the key difference between strictly speaking, the key difference between existence value in an economic sense and inherent value is that existence value still requires that you would be willing to pay something for that environment to be preserved. Whereas inherent value doesn't require that a human being be there to want to pay for it. So that's existence value is maybe the closest thing to inherent value on this list, but it's still a little bit different than inherent value because it requires a person to actually want to pay something for it. So all of these things here are still based on willingness to pay. Okay, so this is kind of just a general overview and a general taxonomy of different values that the environment can have. And all of these together, if we remember the different marginal benefit curves, marginal cost curves for different levels of pollution or different levels of environmental destruction or different levels of environmental amenities, all of these things together would be all combined to construct some of those marginal benefit or marginal cost curves. So like a marginal cost curve of some, like if you think about a marginal external cost curve or marginal damage curve, if you remember, we had something like some quantity of production which led to some marginal external costs. These were marginal external costs associated with the production of something. If we think about the forest resource, the benefits we could get from a forest resource, maybe some of the direct benefits include harvesting that timber, harvesting that wood, and turning it into some kind of consumer durable product. And there's private costs associated with that. The timber company is paying laborers, they're paying lumberjacks to go out and chop down the wood. They're paying for the trucks that ship the wood out to a processing facility to turn it into something more like a 2x4 rather than just a raw piece of tree. Those are private costs, but then the external costs, maybe if we think back to like the chapter 3 where we were talking about externalities, some of those external costs could be, as you harvest more of that timber, you start to lose some of these other services. Like you lose some of the carbon storage, you lose some of the erosion control. If the destruction of the forest is leading to the reduction in species, reduction in the prevalence of species, or destroying some of their habitat, maybe you lose out on some of the wildlife films that could be produced based on that. You lose the option value for maybe having some kind of pharmaceutical product come out of that forest, or you lose the ability in the future to go and recreate in the forest. You don't have the ability to go hiking or camping in that forest once you've chopped it down. If you chop it down, you're not able to pass it on to your to your kids or your grandkids or to future generations, and also you don't get the pleasure of knowing it's there. So this, just to kind of link all this back to what we talked about before, this marginal external cost curve, which we talked about abstractly, and we drew it as kind of just a marginal cost curve that depended on the amount of production that was going on. We now have some maybe a little bit more concrete idea of perhaps all the things that could go into this curve. It's gonna consist of all of these different services, environmental services, which we're losing those services as a result of putting that forest to direct use and chopping it down and turning it into lumber or something like that. Now that we've categorized those values, let us talk about what methods we might use to actually get some of these numbers. So I'm going to go through these one by one. I don't think we'll get through all of these today, but and I'm going to go through these kind of in order from easiest to measure or easiest to value in an economic sense, because there's well, I'll get to that in a second, but I'm going to go from easiest to value down to hardest. So the easiest to value would just be a straight up market valuation. This does not work for hardly any of the things that we just looked at. So a lot of the stuff, 90% of the things that are on this slide, or the value that comes from this slide, wouldn't fall into that, but the timber would. So the timber would be one thing that we could definitely value inside of a market. So that's easy. We have a timber market. We have people buying and selling different quantities and qualities of timber as intermediate goods as well as for final goods, and the kinds of consumer surpluses and producer surpluses that we can find. That's relatively straightforward, at least compared to some of the other kinds of environmental amenities that we might want to value. Now, another way we could pin down what the environmental goods and services that are provided, or the environmental costs that are incurred as a result of dirtying up the environment. One way to do that might be to look at the cost of illness. This is one thing that you could use to say, for example, value clean air in an urban area, for example. So we talked about how sulfur dioxide, we were thinking about theoretically how the efficient pollution amounts could be determined through the equation of marginal benefits and marginal costs. This cost of illness method is what you would use to maybe construct kind of a measure of abatement benefits, or a measure of the reduction benefits that you would get from not having as much sulfur dioxide hanging above an urban area and getting into people's eyes and throats and lungs. So let me give you an example here. This is a table that I found actually last year when I was thinking about coronavirus costs. And this is as I was thinking about how to evaluate costs from coronavirus, I found this table, which was from a study of the 2013 norovirus, which is not as famous, but still had some costs. So one of the things that we can do here, this table has information about the total number of cases up here on the left, and then it breaks down each of those cases according to basically how severe the illness was. So some of the people that got the norovirus, there's about 5.5 million of them. Some of them got sick and didn't visit a hospital or a physician, and they just recovered on their own. So that would be given by these people here. About 4.9 million of the 5.5 million just got sick, and maybe they missed some days of work. And so those costs are indicated here in terms of the loss of productivity that those people endured. And we don't have detailed information on the specific kinds of jobs that they were all working, and the kinds of work that they were missing. But at a population level, we can think about what the average productivity or what the average wage is for a day or two of work. And if it's the case that these 4.9 million people missed a certain quantity of work, a certain number of days of work, we can try to estimate what those numbers were by multiplying that by some kind of expected wage. And it's not gonna get every single person's lost wage exactly correct, but on average we would expect it to be relatively close to something like what the actual loss of productivity was. So it's either the lost wages that they have themselves for missing work, or it's the lost productivity that the employer gets from not having them being able to provide the kinds of goods and services that they were providing at their jobs normally. Okay, so that's the first column. The second column is people that visited a physician but they recovered. So in this case, there would actually be doctor bills, medical bills involved, and in that case, the medical bills are at a minimum what people are willing to pay for dealing with that illness. So the sort of the aggregate costs of those medical bills are given by the numbers here, kind of in the middle under this turquoise bracket. These people are visiting doctors, or maybe visiting the emergency room, or maybe having the doctor come and visit them, but they're not actually staying overnight at the hospital. So there's not hospital costs, but there still are medical costs. And then as you move to the right, there's people that are having more and more severe kinds of treatment. So some of these people, 14,500 of them, are actually being hospitalized, and so they again have medical bills and bills for emergency room visits and hospitalization costs, which are given by this number there. Those are significant for even though the numbers of people that got hospitalized are not as large as the other group. Those costs are extremely high because a hospitalization is very expensive. After the hospitalization occurs, there could be some follow-up visits to the doctors, which could have their own medical bills, and those would be given by the costs in that column that's kind of highlighted in red. And then, unfortunately, some people did not survive the virus, and so we have actually 149 fatalities, and those costs are indicated in that number here, 1.3 billion in terms of the losses of life. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on in this section, but the way that this is typically done is there's what's called the value of a statistical life. And so of course it's crude and kind of icky to be putting dollar values on these things, but in a sense it's unavoidable. If you want to actually have some guidance for how to design policy and consider trade-offs between different kinds of goods and services, if it's possible that, for example, lives could be saved by a certain expenditure of resources, you'd want to have some number on what that's valued, so that you can properly account for that and measure it and actually have an argument for why a certain preventative measure or a certain kind of policy that prevents illness or death is a good idea. We'll talk a bit more about how the value of a statistical life is arrived at, whether or not you'd like to have a value put on your life. The government does put a value on your life. The EPA has a number that they use. It's roughly between, I think it kind of changes every year with inflation, but it's somewhere between $9 and $10 million per life saved. And again, we'll talk about more a little bit later about how that number is arrived at. But at bottom, it's necessary in some way to do this, because some kinds of measures are going to have different risks of death, or put people at different risks, or maybe even save save people from certain risks, and having a way to value that at least is a good starting point. It's not everything. It's not, you might have critiques and arguments for why it's crude and disgusting to be doing that, but at least there's some number to be looking at it and evaluating and debating as a starting point. So that's one way that's built into this this cost of illness method, or I should say that's one way that losses of life are accounted for in this cost of illness method. So altogether, we get all of these costs tallied up, and we get some kind of final number for the total costs of the 2013 norovirus. The third thing, which is also based on actual expenditures, even though these aren't directly marketed goods, like this is like we're trying to put a value on pollution, so it's not directly the pollution that's being valued, but it's the effects of pollution that's being valued through this cost of illness method. In a similar way, we have what's called the replacement cost method, and again, it's not directly buying and selling the environmental services or the ecosystem services, but it is looking at how those services help us to maybe substitute for other kinds of capital that we would otherwise have to produce. So natural capital, one way to think about natural capital is like the services that the environment provides. One way to think about the value of that natural capital is the value of the man-made capital that we can avoid having to produce because that natural capital exists. And let me bring up an example that might be a little bit familiar. This is actually the example we used for the Coase theorem. We were talking about the Coase theorem, and we talked about how New York City, down here on the bottom, was sending money to landowners in upstate New York in order to purchase development easements, or to pay them not to develop their land in certain critical areas in order to preserve the quality of the water that was being supplied to New York City in the reservoirs that they were drawing from. So these services, this land in upstate New York, these services that are being provided up here are sort of like water purification services. When the water goes into a wetland or is filtered through forest vegetation or tall grass, that vegetation helps to actually filter out pollutants before that water gets into the water supply. It helps to filter out the pollutants before the water goes into the groundwater system or into a stream or a lake. And so there are pretty important and valuable services, water purification services, being provided by the undeveloped land, the wetlands and the forest in these upstate New York areas. And one way to value those is by considering what are they replacing. So those things that are replacing water treatment facilities, expensive water treatment facilities that New York City would otherwise have to construct, which would have very high construction costs, very high operating and maintenance costs. And if you can preserve that land in upstate New York, you're able to avoid those expenditures on expensive water treatment. So that's one way to put a price tag, in a sense, on the services that are being provided by land in upstate New York. One way to put a price tag on it is to consider, if that land is there and we leave it undeveloped and we do not use it towards economic production or use it towards building housing developments, if we preserve it, we get these benefits, we get this natural capital, which ends up substituting, very importantly, for expensive man-made capital. Okay, so that's one of the ways that we can actually put a number on some of those ecosystem services is to consider what we would have to do in their absence. If we did not have those services being provided, what kinds of expenditures would we have to make? Okay, and again, it's a little bit, it's still based on marketed goods and services. It's still based on things that do have easy to estimate price tags. Hospital bills, those things are visible on your invoice. The costs of these water treatment facilities, those are just engineering costs that are very relatively easy to get a hold of if you know the cost of materials and labor and energy. But then eventually, next class we'll consider things that are a little bit trickier to value, where we have to kind of go through the back door a little bit more to put a price tag on different kinds of environmental amenities, which don't have direct links to marketed goods and services, or goods and services that have direct monetary values.